This is Restless. Welcome back to Restless Summer, everybody. I assume that's what you're here for. Or maybe you're here for the second part of our interview with Dr. Brad Vermurlen. Well, if so, that's what you're going to get. So let's jump into right before he started to explain cultural entropy.
And by the end, I talk about it as cultural entropy. Cultural here doesn't refer to the broader American culture, but it refers to American evangelicalism itself as its own as its own religious culture that in previous decades had at least somewhat more coherence and togetherness to it, and that especially since the 90s and after the turn of the millennium has started to fall apart and break down, I think. So that's basically the idea of cultural entropy that I propose at the end of the book as a different way of thinking about secularization. So I'd say American evangelicalism is secularizing within itself. So it's close to internal secularization, but it's in the sense that a previously coherent cultural system is starting to break down and fall apart and kind of dissolve and go in different ways.
I think that often describes my experience, my relationship with evangelicalism. I often call myself barely an evangelical because I've know very little about what that means anymore, right? The traditional, is it Bebington, right? The quadrilateral of all of those things, right? Those things I haven't changed my opinion on, right? The biblicism, the Christ-centered, the conversion, right? All of these things I haven't changed, but it seems to me that, yeah, I think what you're saying is exactly true, that whatever that those things might have been the narrative, the cultural center of evangelicalism. And right now, what actually is central to evangelicalism is at least much less clear than it probably was 50, 60 years ago. So what does it look like in evangelicalism, or more generally as these cultural systems start to break down?
Right. Before I answer that question, if you don't mind, I'd like to say something about the Bebington quadrilateral.
Sure. Yeah, please do.
So traditionally, I guess recently, since it was proposed in the late 80s, the Bebington quadrilateral has served as these four benchmarks that are supposed to define evangelicalism. But what I do in my book is I use the Bebington quadrilateral, those four features, not as these kind of clear traits that mark you as an evangelical or not, but what they become are precisely the terms on which the infighting is fought. So I call them rules. Actually, they become less traits and more rules you should follow, and that people get in trouble for not following sufficiently from the perspective of the conservatives. So that's why you have people critiquing other evangelical leaders for being insufficiently biblical or not taking the crucifixion of Christ seriously enough in some way or in some insufficient manner. These biblicism, crucicentrism, conversionism, and activism, these become precisely the terms on which the fight is fought, and not so much defining traits anymore. Because the problem is they're like tools that you can wield in like fighting over precisely these terms. So biblicism means taking the Bible really seriously, right? The problem occurs when people who hold non-traditional interpretations still think they're taking the Bible really seriously, and then you're like, okay, well, and then there's this huge blow up, and it's like, so the Bebington Four become, you can look at them differently, which I do in the book. So
that's really interesting. This idea that, right, that if I'm trying to gain a positioning in evangelicalism right now, I can, how do I move people out of influence? How do I get Rob Bell out of his place of prominence, or any of these? How do I call out World Vision? These examples. I find one of the things that are central to evangelicalism, and I say, aha, we've got you. You're not this, right? How do I How do I tell young evangelicals progressives aren't evangelical, right? That's not an option going forward because, whether it's biblicism, right? Whatever the thing is that they're not getting. I think that's really interesting that they have become rules or tools, rather than
Traits.
traits of describing
Yeah, because
evangelical
viewing
religion.
them as traits assumes that they are, clearly defined and everybody agrees on what they mean. But that's not what you see empirically in American evangelicalism, and so they become these rules, and people are, calling you out, saying, "Hey, you're not following this rule sufficiently," and so that's where a lot of the infighting. It's not where it comes from, but it's kind of the way it's talked about in a sense, and you have one of the phrases that in sociology is talked about is what's at stake in a field, and you have religious leaders using that language too, and they don't. It's sociological language that like the gospel is at stake or the Bible is at stake or something like that, right?
Yeah, I wonder. Thinking about again the idea of differentiation, entropy, stemming off of the Reformation or wherever you want to place it. So you see that, maybe at one point when you have a more consistent evangelicalism, you have this, quadrilateral, but even that has kind of been, you have that as kind of a, I'm not trying to be coy about it, but like a kind of dumbing down of maybe a larger, kind of confessional framework, or, you have the, here are the fundamentals all of a sudden in the early 20th century, that these are what now mark us out, as opposed to those who are going liberal, at least in, Northern Presbyterianism. And so you get, okay, well, here's the fundamentals, or maybe, here's the quadrilateral, here's the things that we're about. But because you're already, you're already sliding down the hill, like you're already experiencing this entropy, inevitably you get to the point where what was kind of like a dividing line or like a clear, like, marking out of this is who we are, all of a sudden has to become something where now we have to divide within that as well. And so there's just this continual like pulling apart, even as you get smaller and smaller within, what exactly it is that defines you. Does that sound even close to right? That's what I'm hearing.
Yes. So I don't say this in the book, but I think confessionalism is one of the solutions to a lot of what we're talking about, right? The infighting and the entropy and the evangelical leaders going in different directions on all sorts of issues, right? So a lot of this is a problem for non-confessional, especially low church evangelicals. But if you're a confessional evangelical Lutheran, I mean, Lutherans are so quiet and polite. They don't argue, right? You don't see Lutherans in these conversations. So, and I think it's somewhat the same for Presbyterians, right? They have their confessional statements going and historical, like going back to the first 2 centuries after the Reformation. So it's, I think they have less at stake in these battles than, say, your, typical non-denominational or otherwise low church evangelical.
Well, Brad, if earlier you lost our audience critiquing the reformers, we have a lot of confessional listeners, so you're back in with them, presenting that as a solution. So
I'm vindicated. Yes,
you're vindicated. So tell us what it looks like when these kinds of this cultural entropy begins. What does that look like? Because as you said, it's more of an abstract way of understanding this.
Right. What does it look like? I mean, I don't know, right? In the book, I propose it at the end and only in like 2 or 3 pages. And I say, like, I don't have the space to work this out fully. I think it would take a whole book. And I think there's been other, like, I'm not the first one to ever think of secularization this way. I think Charles Taylor's A Secular Age talks about a little bit of the kind of more qualitative kind of falling apart of things older. But what it would look like, I guess, what you're asking is how would we measure this, right? So one thing would be like people who previously got along not getting along anymore, people who previously could worship together can no longer worship together, people who previously agreed on things now agree on less, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
You might even see, at the organizational level, you'll either see organizations springing into existence to defend a certain position, or else, falling out of existence for various reasons, whether that's losing mission drift or scandal or whatever. So there's a few things that basically you're asking is, what does it look like for something to fall apart, right? And it's hard to like explain, but I think we have a general sense of what that might look like.
Yeah, and I wonder if even part of this, maybe on a more abstract level, right? An example outside of evangelicalism would be, even about the United States, these questions of what is the narrative of America, right? Is it the land of the free? Is it these kinds of questions, or one of the big, in the Reformation, right? The story of salvation is justification by faith alone, or was it the Roman Catholic notion before that? These things that held those cultures, whether it was an ecclesiastical culture or a national culture, these narratives, these beliefs, right, are now being either, and this is what you're saying, they're now being debated, they're not agreed on, we don't share them, this same vision going forward.
Yeah. And it's like, how far can it go, right?
Sure.
How far can something fall apart? So I think Campbell and Putnam in American Grace show that statistically over decades, there's consistently been like a 10% really committed Christians, right, who are like just conservative on every issue. And so on some level, there's like this, at least recently, there's been this like 10% figure that's like really not going anywhere or whatever. But still, I think I'm broader, looking at the full picture. It's you're not seeing Reformed people having conferences with holiness people or that type of thing. It's just they're not interested in doing anything together, really, very much. So
and is the weakness in the evangelical institutions, this falling apart, is that what gave the New Calvinists the opportunity to get to the places of influence that they got to, because they were kind of up for grabs, to put it not technically?
Right. So I think it's kind of a funny story, actually, because before the New Calvinism came on the scene in, say, 2006 or whatever you want to say, there was this starting to see a little bit of falling apart with, postmodernist philosophy, and people, almost nobody was LGBTQ affirming at the time, but you started to get this sense that maybe this is around the corner. And you saw gender egalitarianism was there already. And so you saw these on a few issues, at least. You saw this kind of maybe troubles on the horizon, and then there was the therapeutic aspect was there with the seeker-sensitive movement and all of this going on. And so the New Calvinism presents itself as a conservative historic alternative to all of that. And so in that sense, yes, there's a story of leading up to the New Calvinism. But in the book, I also tell the story that after kind of the advent, if you will, of the New Calvinism, say 2006, 7, 8, for the next 10 years, it doesn't get any more peaceful in American evangelicalism by any means, right? You still see probably even increased disagreement and fighting, now explicitly on LGBTQ affirmation and gay marriage and all sorts of other things. And gender egalitarianism, I think, is stronger than ever. And so, and I hate to keep going back to the same sex and gender topics. We can think of other topics too that are, but those, religious liberty, maybe, I don't know, we can get really, we can talk about environmentalism, or if you want, or immigration, but anyways, on all sorts of topics, and not just moral, but also like theological topics. So the infighting and the disagreement has continued. So there's this entropy building up to when people started talking about and recognizing the New Calvinism, but then there's also this. It didn't stop, right? They didn't solve the problem within American evangelicalism. A lot of the infighting among evangelical leaders actually helped to fortify and recognize the New Calvinism as a thing, as an identifiable expression of evangelicalism. So now in 2021, I think what we see a lot, mind you, I don't pay nearly as much attention to American evangelicalism as I did when I was researching this book, but my general sense is that you see a little bit more just like ignoring each other. They're not so much interested in fighting anymore. They just they're just is this uneasy coexistence of different expressions of evangelical Christianity.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And it might be because there's even more infighting. I find it interesting that the entropy has continued, even with and you can tell me if this is this kind of entropy, the list of big, prominent New Calvinist leaders from, 2012, a lot of those names are out of favor. We take pleasure on our show when you're not here to do things like find the videos of Mark Driscoll, the Gospel Coalition, used to post, and watch those. And because there's so many of these leaders that have left the faith, left their churches. Sadly, some have committed suicide even. And that seems to me to be a sign of the continuing cultural entropy.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, there's something negative going on there for sure, but I don't know if cultural entropy would be the type of dynamic that I would want to kind of sink down to that micro or personal level. It's more of something that happens to systems, right, and structures like American evangelicalism as a whole. But so when you have the thing, I'm not saying it's like, so it's definitely something happened and it's negative and it's a problem for the new Calvinism. I don't know if that would be something I would call cultural entropy though, right? It would be like, that's a separate issue of like celebrity pastors and like accountability and stuff like that, which if you were to amplify it up and look at it at a field level, then maybe we could talk about cultural entropy, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know what we would call like a list of 10 megachurch pastors really falling out of favor. So
yeah, and maybe the final thing we should look at is, as New Calvinism, in Michael and I's view, certainly is falling apart, even as some of the men who were at the head of it are reaching retirement age. I want to ask you about kind of your thesis about a conservative religion in this modern milieu. What can we learn from New Calvinism about religious strength? What are things we can think about from your point of view going forward?
Okay, yeah, that's a whole other issue. It's like the flip side of religious weakness. Is like, how can you, as like conservative Christians or conservative Christian organizations, is there any chance to flourish in such a context, right?
Yeah, it even say, I mean, even as we talk, I'm like, man, we have just painted a super depressing picture of what life in the church can look like in our culture. And so, yeah, if there's this huge force of this, kind of entropy that's pulling everything apart, what is there that can stand in the midst of that?
Right. I'm glad we're talking about it then. So again, just for brief background, in sociology, I'm not the first one to try to answer that question. There's been answers in the past, right? So one is basically, and I don't accept. So one I don't accept basically is that religion in a society functions basically like any other consumer good, and it's a product of supply and demand dynamics. And so that the more pluralism you have, the more religious products on offer, the more participation you'll have, right? And so that pluralism isn't really that big of a problem for conservative religion because it opens up a free market and it just the market thrives with competition. That's one view. I don't think it holds up empirically or historically, but anyways, another view is something called status discontent theory, and it's basically that the religious leaders start to get really anxious about their status whether that's culturally or economically or whatever, and like, oh no, we no longer are where we used to be. And so they rally the troops and they organize their resources and they launch campaigns and they become strong instead. To me, that doesn't have much explanatory power. It's almost tautological. It's like, oh, we were strong. Oh no, we're becoming weak. Let's become strong instead. It doesn't really give me much of a story there. Another one, for example, would be like what Christian Smith has called sheltered enclave theory, which is basically hunker down and protect yourselves from the various aspects of the modern world, and hopefully conservative Christians can survive. I think
kind of like Benedict option.
Exactly. I was going to say that it's like I think the Benedict option is kind of a newer articulation of that older theory. So yes, that's one of the options. And there's a couple more that I won't get into, but the one that I focus on in the book, which I do think is new, is an emphasis on. So think about it. How do you try to hold a cultural system falling apart together? Well, effort, right? Trying. And the idea is that, and I think you see this at the churches I study, right? You see people like religious leaders trying to create good worship experiences and put forth compelling arguments and write books that will persuade people and to be a good Christian in the world and to get to know your neighbors and to all this stuff, right? So I think one of the most overlooked theories in sociology about how conservative religion can thrive in the modern world is basically like a little bit of effort and thought, and what else can you do but try, right?
Yeah.
So that's the theory. That's my theory. So I call it strategic action field theory, basically, where you have in this broader landscape, you have, and sometimes it involves like maneuvering and positioning like in certain ways to like market yourself in a certain way. But other times it's just like, how you present yourself in public, just think about Tim Keller in New York City. He's a great example of like trying to be persuasive to certain audiences. Yeah. And what else can you do, right? So that's the thought.
Yeah. I wonder, on a theological level, it seems like one of the things that the new Calvinism had going for it was the emphasis on, either, if you want to put like the sovereignty of God over everything, or, kind of Jesus is Lord over every area of your life, or the, hey, glorify God in every area of life, everything that you do. And what these provided, I think, in some ways was at least one way to try to collect all of these different, as everything's differentiating, it collects them all again and says, well, no, in education, in your home life, in how you eat, in how you exercise, in how whatever you do, glorify God. Whatever you do, God is sovereign over it. And so it provided maybe a kind of system almost that held everything together, at least in part, or at least tried to, right? And so maybe this is one of the things that allowed the new Calvinism to act, at least in some strength, at least for a time. And so I wonder if we can learn from that, this need to have, even just on a theological or intellectual level, like a worldview or a way of looking at everything that says, no, these are not, all of these things are not separate. We shouldn't atomize everything, but actually they're all a part of one whole. And to have that more kind of organic way of looking at everything as it works together, I think is probably going to be part of, what it looks like to return to some kind of strength.
Yeah, Pastor Michael, I think you're getting at two things. That one, they were positioning themselves in places where maybe we could say there were persuadable people in the field, persuadable institutions, persuadable people. And then they were actually relying on the resources that conservative Christianity, conservative religion comes with, because it does come with, well, thousands of years of thought about life, about work, and trying to present that to people that they thought were persuadable, right? Tim Keller, this is the emphasis on the cities. There are persuadable people in the cities. Young evangelicals are persuadable. Is this what you're talking about? Brad?
Yes, yeah, and this is what I get into in the second half of my book once I kind of start to spell out my explanatory model. So after I've set the context and described everything and put up the theory, basically I walk through all these ways that new Calvinist leaders have strategically positioned themselves or maneuvered, and sometimes it's like, moving into cities. I talk about emphasizing a sovereign big God for young evangelicals and a few other things. There's a whole, again, gender and sexual dynamic there that a lot of young people might be persuadable. So there's certain things that, just because I call something strategic, I don't mean it's disingenuous. I mean it's deliberative. It requires thought and effort, and it offers you, as a religious leader, like a potentially a advantage in advancing your religious worldview among a certain, audience. So I spell out 8 or 10 ways that new Calvinist leaders did this, from like 2008 to the time, I finished like 2016, 17.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's, contextualizing is something I talk about in the book, right? Just like, contextualizing it to your city and knowing the type of people who are there and the mood of your city and that type of thing. So,
let me ask one question about this, that, a person, if I was thinking about an objection to your theory, it would be that as things become more modern, as things become, or as postmodernism takes root, isn't that now, or why does your theory think this strategic field action breaks down the inherent barriers to conservative religion that a hyper-secular person, the hyper-secular milieu of, right, all egalitarian, right, the affirming of LGBT, the not belief in the Bible that the way the new Calvinists presented. What about what you're saying? Why does that work in that setting? Because it almost sounds like it wouldn't.
Right. So my claim is not that it entirely breaks down those barriers.
Okay.
For even the majority of people. Basically, it's so I draw from business literature on strategy, and one of the principles of strategy in the business literature is that a good strategy is not for everyone. And so it's basically get the low-hanging fruit, and it's get who you can, I guess, right? So it's not gonna, my claim isn't that it's going to completely overhaul and like persuade, most people. So it's just like, there's going to be a segment of, I guess you might call it a target audience or whatever, that can be persuaded and will be persuaded. And so do what you can in that regard.
It would be like saying the Calvinists with a sovereign God should go find the elect, and they will be persuaded of truth, right?
Hey, I'm just a social scientist.
Yep. And we're just podcasters. Well, Pastor Michael, before we close our time on this, is there anything else you want to ask or add before we end?
Yeah, I find this very helpful. And not too long ago, I preached from Psalm 1. And there's this clear distinction in Psalm 1 between the one who meditates upon the law of God, right? The righteous man. And he's like this tree. And there's this image of this kind of organic growth. He's this tree that, his roots are down deep. He's right by the source of life, this stream. And so he's always bearing fruit, even when, it seems like he shouldn't be. Like his leaf does not wither. Whereas the wicked can't stand in the judgment of God, and they're like chaff that the wind blows away. And it seems to me that, like any kind of entropy, this is part of the fallen world, cultural entropy being part of that. I think this is what sin does. It tears apart. It atomizes. It moves increasingly toward death, if you could call it that. That's how I would define it. Probably not the best social science word, but from pastoral perspective, right? This is what I'm going to call it. And you have, on the other hand, this option of, there is a way, I think that the Lord himself has provided for us, where you can have this kind of long-term, stable, organic growth in godliness, individually, corporately, that actually has this, lasting stability to it. And so I'm just meditating upon that as we talk about these ideas of cultural entropy and what to do, where to go next.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area to think about, so it's important.
Once again, big thanks to Brad for coming on the show. We hope you enjoyed this interview. As I mentioned, you can find this full part 1 and part 2 of this interview unedited on YouTube. All right, check it out. Check back with us next week for some more Restless Summer.